document, in some practice test somewhere. I'm pretty sure, I could be making that up at this stage, but, who can tell me what happened with the Checkers speech? What happened, Connor?
I think like someone accused him of taking bribes, and he was like, "I don't take bribes. The only thing I've received was my cash checkers or something."
Close. He was accused of taking illegal campaign donations, not necessarily bribes, but that he was being given money. And it wasn't a cat, it was a dog. But you're right there. That he says, you know, my wife doesn't own a fur coat. She owns a good Republican cloth coat. And yes, we took one gift from a campaign supporter, from a supporter. It was our dog, and a Cocker Spaniel that our 6-year-old named Checkers. And I don't care what they say. That's real important because that is classic Nixon, the conspiracy, you know. I don't care what they say, we're not giving the dog back. Here's what happened. After these allegations came out, Eisenhower, who's the candidate, is pressured to drop Nixon from the ticket. And he really wants to because he knows Nixon's a creep. This is going to give him an out from having Richard Nixon. But Nixon circumvents Eisenhower's decision making and on his own goes on television. And Americans love it. Television's very new in 1952. And so Eisenhower's kind of forced to keep Nixon on the ticket. And I always say that's one of those places I want to go back in history and just like sabotage the cameras that night when that goes on stage and keep Nixon out of politics. In 1960, you know that television comes back to bite Nixon in the butt in 1960. They have the very first televised debates. Please don't say it's the first presidential debates, because that's not true. But the first televised debates. Nixon had been sick. He's kind of gray looking. He's got circles under his eyes. He refuses to have makeup put on his face. He's, you know, makeup on. I'm not a woman. I don't put makeup on. Whereas JFK has media specialists. His brother-in-law is a Hollywood movie star named Peter Lawford. He knows how to work the cameras. And so even though in reality Kennedy is the sickly one, Kennedy would never get elected today because of his illnesses that the public didn't know about. On television, Kennedy comes out looking like the picture of health and youth and vitality, and you know, he looks suntanned and all of that, whereas Nixon's sweating under the cameras. People who listened to it on the radio felt that Nixon had a slight edge. But those who watched it on television, and I said that right, you listen to it on the radio, Nixon. Watching it on TV, which most people did by 1960, the edge goes to Kennedy. Kennedy also won. He got the African American vote that could vote. We still have Jim Crow in the Deep South, but African Americans were mobilized in the North and in the West to go out and vote. Why? Why did African Americans vote for Kennedy in large numbers? Why were they energized to go out and vote? The what?
The summer thing.
He did something. He called. Remember we saw that video? Or no, I'm thinking of the one I watched on Robert Kennedy the other day. But he called Malcolm. Lord have mercy, what's wrong with me? Martin Luther King is in jail. Yeah. Again, right? And Mrs. King is very worried about him in jail this time. That she is worried that something's going to happen to him. And John Kennedy picks up the phone and calls her and says, we'll see what we can do. And he calls on one of his political allies to call the chief of police down in, I want to say it was Georgia, wherever King was in jail, and they let him go, and he walks out. And Martin Luther King encourages African American voters to get out and vote. And that was impactful. Third, some historians believe that the election was stolen, that there were shenanigans, particularly in Illinois, particularly in Chicago. Chicago was led by a family, the Daley family, that one after another were the mayors of Chicago, and they believe that they helped the cemeteries vote. Y'all know what that means, right? So, important election. I cannot remember the name of his party, George Wallace's party. It's like the American Independent Party or something. I'll look it up. But George Wallace, we know him. He's the governor of Alabama who makes a name for himself on being adamantly opposed to integration. He stands in the doorway at the University of Alabama to block the African American students from coming in. You saw that on Forrest Gump when she drops the book and Forrest picks it up. Please, for the love of God, do not write about Forrest Gump in any of your essays or DBQs. I know he was, but we're not going to write about him in our essays. George Wallace very famously that day said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He runs for president as a third-party candidate in 1968. And what is particularly scary, if you go back and look in pageant at the outcomes, they do those charts for all of them, is not just that he got a lot of votes down here. I think he even wins electoral votes down here, but he gets votes up in some of these areas. George Wallace's support, and the support for Wallace in 68 is a harbinger of things to come. This conservatism is out there. What does Richard Nixon, who does win in 68, call this mass of people who are not getting media coverage, but who are out there and who are conservative? Silent majority. Very good. So that's important in that election. I put 1994 up. Who was president in 94? It's an off-year election. Bill Clinton, excellent. Remember, when in doubt, Reagan in the 80s, Clinton in the 90s. There's that brief W. Bush in that, from 89 to 93. There is a massive backlash against Clinton's health care initiative in his first term, in his first year in office. And Republicans take the House of Representatives for the first time in decades. Who is the leader of the Republicans in the House? Good, Newt Gingrich, excellent. A strong conservative. He has his contract with America. You can see that in a document. And we're going to bring conservatism back. Fiscal conservatism. And a lot of Americans supported that. The gays in the military, forget about it. All of these topics that seem to have taken over the liberalizing. We're going to totally fight against universal health care. The problem was, the thing that really brought Newt Gingrich down was Newt Gingrich. He had what my dad called diarrhea of the mouth. He could not stop it from running. And he's the guy that said, forget about welfare. If parents can't take care of their children, put them in orphanages. Good old days. And he kept saying things like that. He goes after Bill Clinton with impeachment proceedings after 96. Remember, Bill Clinton is impeached in his second term in office. I should have had the election of 1992 up here. Why? Bill Clinton's elected, first baby boomer president. Ross Perot was a significant third-party candidate in 1992. Even though he did not win any electoral votes, he probably siphoned off enough votes from H.W. Bush to give the electoral, in each state, to give the electoral college to Bill Clinton. Does that make sense? Tell me what we all know about Bush v. Gore. Who ruined it for Al Gore in Florida? Ralph Nader, the Green Party, exactly. He took lots of votes, 90,000 votes just in Florida, and I don't think most environmentalists would have been voting for George W. Bush. They would have voted for Al Gore probably, and those Green Party votes swayed Florida. Who can tell me the constitutional justification for the Supreme Court's ruling in Bush v. Gore?
Wasn't that to be taken from all counties?
And so what was that violating? That the recount was only being done in certain hand-picked counties, Al Gore's hand-picked counties. What is that?
Equal protection.
Equal protection. The Supreme Court cited the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment as being violated by this, so they ended the recount. The Supreme Court does not rule Bush wins, they rule the recount has to stop and the votes have to be where it is at this time. Does that make sense to everybody? I can't think of anything in 2008 other than, you know, the historic nature of Barack Obama being elected. The economy was bad, and I just, that's all I got to say about that. The one in 2016 should not be on here. All I can say is if it is, the only thing I can think of is the rise of populism, social conservatism plus fiscal liberalism. A lot of people who voted for Trump are social conservatives. They're, not all people, but the social conservatives today were opposed to same-sex marriage decisions, opposed to extended welfare, what else? Abortion, immigration. They wanted immigration reform or immigration enforcement. So there's those social things, but they also tended to want trade restrictions. They wanted to end NAFTA, and those are not typically things that we see fiscally conservative things. Most conservatives in the Republican Party, fiscal conservatives, want free trade. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. That's all I can think about that you might get, and that would be, there'd be some teachers raising Cain if there was an election of 2016 on this test, so I'm not expecting it.
We watched it happen, so I feel like we'd be okay.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that would be okay. Let me call roll, and then I want to go talk back through political parties. We did elections and kind of hit on them. For those of you in my class, I would take out those charts if you have them that I made you do yesterday. Take a different colored pen or pencil and with their hair and their pot and all of that stuff. And so what do? Who do we elect in 1968? Richard Nixon, the most conservative person up until 2000, and I don't even think Trump's really conservative. So really the most conservative person in American history is elected president, right in the middle of what we think of as the great liberal period. And by great, I don't mean good, I mean big liberal period in American history. Does that make sense? So political parties act as a check on one another. And when Little Britain, doesn't he? He wants us to have a great navy, to be a world superpower. Okay? If he wants that, what does he need from a national government to make us a commercial power? Well, we need a strong national government. We need a government that's going to regulate interstate commerce. We need a government that's going to regulate international commerce. We need a strong navy to protect our ships against all those pirates in the Atlantic. What else do we need, according to Hamilton? We need a national bank. We've got to have a national bank. Does that make sense? He says these things will bring us out of this depression that we're in. Jefferson wants what? What's his ideal? Agrarian society, one made up of small independent farmers. He believes that those who toil the land, and I will not go off on a Jefferson rant today, but he believes that those who work the soil are the most moral, that it's when you get into cities that you get corruption and greed and all of those things, and that we need to be an agrarian nation. We need strict constructionism. That national government that was created in the Constitution can only have the powers enumerated to it. Does that make sense? So what begins to happen, obviously, Jefferson and Hamilton are butting heads, right? Poor John Adams. Do y'all remember, did we watch that segment of John Adams where he's just kind of sitting there and they're just yelling at each other? And what eventually happens in Congress and in the state legislatures is people begin to kind of side with Jefferson's view of government or Hamilton's view of government. So they are Jefferson's men and Hamilton's men. And then they get names like Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians. And then they decided, oh, that's kind of cult of personality. They start really having meetings about who are we going to run for these offices in these states. And so we decide we need a name, and so we become the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, and the Federalist, Hamilton. Does that make sense? It's an evolutionary process throughout Washington's administration. Which party is Washington a member of?
Neither.
Neither. Some historians want to put him as a Federalist. They believe he sides with the Federalists a little bit more, but he's not in a political party. John Adams is a Federalist, the only president up there who is a Federalist. The Federalists support obviously strong ties with Britain. I read that in a lot of your short answers today. That was good. They supported strong continued trade with Britain. If you want to be commercial, then you got to trade with Britain. They're the biggest economic power in the world. They want a strong navy. They want a national bank. They want protective tariffs. They don't get that one. That's the one that Hamilton doesn't get. They want, I'm missing something. They want to pay off the debt. If you want to be paid off. He also recommends that we offer bondholders a perpetual debt that will pay you interest. Why? Why not go ahead and pay them off? Thomas owes a bunch of bonds from the war, a bunch of war bonds. He's really rich. What's the benefit in not paying him that money back and just paying interest?
Thomas has a stake in the country.
Absolutely. This is going to tie the wealthy people, the success of the wealthy, to the success of the United States. And they are going to continue to support a strong national government. Brilliant, right? How does he get his assumption of the debts? Because remember, Hamilton says, we got to pay off all the debts. We got to pay off not only the United States debts, but we got to pay off South Carolina and Virginia and Massachusetts and Rhode Island's debts as well. Why is Virginia opposed to that? They paid theirs off. Why should Virginia pay national taxes to pay off South Carolina's debts? Now y'all know we hadn't paid off our debts in South Carolina. So we're in favor. There are a lot of Federalists in South Carolina. What's the deal? We ultimately pay off the state debts. We assume, it's called assumption. We assume the state debts. Why? Come on, it's at a dinner party.
They can't do it by themselves.
Well, common sense is a big part of it, but common sense alone doesn't do it. Y'all are being magnanimous. This is a deal. Why does Virginia agree to the assumption of state debts when it's
Rufus compromise?
Bill of Rights.
I'll let you
the national capital is put on the Potomac? Not up here, not halfway somewhere, but right across the river from George Washington's home.
Right in
And
the middle of the country.
that is going to give. Is there anybody that lives in Northern Virginia today who doesn't work for the national government?
No.
I mean, that one person, but no,
No.
the rest don't, right? And those people, well, anyway, I don't need to go into all of that. Virginia benefited greatly, and that's what swayed it. No great, I see what's best for the country. None of that. What's good for Virginia? The Federalists are going to be fiscally conservative throughout their short period in history. They are going, when's the last election that they run somebody? 1816, and that's kind of an embarrassment, right? Rufus King. Why do the Federalists die out or get sucked into the Democratic Republican Party? They're against the War of 1812, and we win. We beat the British for a second time. They're a party of elites. Number two. Huh? Their issues aren't relevant anymore. Everybody's agreeing to a national bank now. The Democratic Republican president, James Madison, signs off on a national bank, signs off on a protective tariff in 1816. So in CompGov, we call that co-optation. The Democratic Republicans co-opted the Federalist agenda, okay? So, for about 10 years, 8 years, we only have one political party in American history, the Democratic Republicans. As such, one newspaper writer named it the era of good feelings. Now, wrong class, APUS loves to ask you is, was it really an era of good feelings? Evidence, one political party. We seem to have one vision for America, the rise of the market revolution. I always call it the rise of the market economy, but the market revolution. coming about during this time. We are very patriotic. We write patriotic books. James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans, who's the other one? Washington Irving. They write about the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and we get the Star Spangled Banner during this time. We get a rise of patriotism, and for the first time, really, a lot of Americans are identifying as Americans first, South Carolinians second.
Is that also like rallying around the flag because of the First People like War of 1812? Like we're hitting the conflict with Britain, so everyone's like.
Absolutely. There's nothing to improve patriotism like a war against somebody else. Think about that within your own families. Nothing unites siblings as much as fighting against your parents.
That's very true.
I have a question. This is kind of unrelated. What was the lost generation? The people who wrote stuff.
1920s. That's Fitzgerald, Hemingway, those guys.
Don't we get to?
Are you with me? Evidence that it was not an era of good feeling, Panic of 1819, big. The Missouri Compromise split the nation in 1820. It was not an era of good feelings for Florida when Andrew Jackson went invaded and killed a bunch of people. It was not an era of good feelings for slaves. It was not an era of good feelings for Indians. Don't forget those people.
Wait,
The, of 1816.